and this is lesson 8 in Old Testament survey. Primary focus today is on the life of Isaac, but we are going to finish the Abraham section since we did not get that completed in our last session. So we'll start back a few chapters from the assigned reading today in chapter 17. So, briefly, let me pick up in chapter 16, just reading this short paragraph. Lacking faith in the power of God, Sarai despairs of ever having children of her own. She gives her handmaiden Hagar, the Egyptian, to her husband, who takes her as his concubine and produces Ishmael. The story of Ishmael begins the long enmity between the Arab descendants of Abram and the Israelite descendants of Abraham. The slave, probably acquired during their ill-fated trip to Egypt from many years earlier, is given by Sarai to Abraham, and a son is born when Abraham is 86 years old. And of course, Sarai is 76, but she didn't give birth to this one. Sarai mistreats the young woman, leading to her flight and rescue by the Lord, who sends her and her son back to the camp. That brings us to chapter 17, where we'll pick up today. 13 years have gone by. Abram is now 99 years old. It's interesting how often we see these long periods of gap between chapters, right? Not to mention the fact that sometimes the events recorded here might actually have happened before events covered in the previous chapter, because that holistic method of telling stories is how the people of the ancient East would write. Chapter 17 begins, after 13 years, when Abram and Sarai are 99 and 89 years old respectively, God returns to Abram and Sarai and confirms the promise of Isaac, the seed of promise, and changes their names to Abraham and Sarah, further solemnizing the covenant between them. God reveals himself by the name Almighty for the first time. God has been mocked by the faithless act of fornication between Abram and Hagar. It was an affront to God's omnipotence to believe that postmenopausal infertility would be too great an obstacle for the creator of Sarah's womb to overcome. The Almighty in verse 5 changes Abram's name to Abraham, and in verse 15, the Almighty changes Sarai's name to Sarah. Abram, exalted father, becomes Abraham, father of multitudes. Sarai, strong-willed, becomes Sarah, princess. What is more, by changing their names, the Almighty also took the next step in the process of covenant making, the exchange of names. When entering into a blood covenant between two clan leaders or kings, each would add a portion of the other's name to their own. In this case, God, whose name is transliterated from Hebrew is YHWH, Yahweh, took the first H out of his own name and gave it to Abram. 1 Chronicles 1:27 says, Abram, the same is Abraham. The difference was not anything of Abram. It was God in Abram. The Hebrew letter H is Hath. This is also the word for breath or spirit. God gave his very breath to Abraham and Sarah and placed his spirit in them. The difference between Abram and Abraham is nothing intrinsic to the man. It is God's breath and spirit in him. God also gives Abraham the covenant sign of circumcision at this time. God promises that in the following year, God would visit them and give them a son. Abraham fell on his face laughing, asking God to accept Ishmael. So, Let's pause there for a moment to give you a chance to digest what we've just read and ask questions or make comments. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. God also spake to Abimelech, the king of the city state of Gerar, and essentially told him, this woman is someone's husband. Pharaoh noticed Abraham uh, sporting with his wife. Um, there's uh, there's a lot of interesting times when God seems to speak to people we would not expect to know who the Lord is, right? Yep. Right. Mhm. Right. Yeah. Um, the changing of the names is very significant. You know, the H that is added to each of the names of Abraham and Sarah is significant because the covenant making process includes the exchange of names. So when uh, when Abram is given an H and Sarai is given an H, that in and of itself is symbolic of the covenant, which is being restated and somewhat expanded here. And at the same time, it's interesting that the letter he chooses is also a Hebrew word that means breath, and symbolically, because it means breath, it can also mean spirit. Did Is that something that any of you had ever given thought to before? Is that new to anyone? Yeah. So yeah, it's somewhat obscure. I'm not the originator of it, but it is somewhat obscure. It's a really um, interesting symbolic act when you think about the name change in that regard. So um, so Abraham falls on his face, laughing at the idea that he's going to have a son with Sarah, and he's asking God to accept Ishmael, and God honors that request on behalf of Ishmael. That's going to come back to bite the Israelites and possibly the rest of the world, don't you think? Yeah. Yes. um, mhm. Right. Well, it may have been either one of them that was the reason they hadn't had children earlier. But Sarah makes the specific comment that it's past the time of childbearing for her, which seems to indicate she knows she's gone through menopause. They may not have called it that, but they knew what it was. So my guess is that God intentionally prevented them from having a child until they were older, specifically so that there could be no question that Isaac's birth was a miraculous act of God. If you wait until a woman can't possibly conceive and she conceives anyway, that's a divine act. That's a supernatural event. And I think God did that on purpose. Otherwise, I think they would have had plenty of children by the time they were 75 and 65 and entered the promised land. Right. Yep. Um, Moving to chapter 18, this is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, or I should say, the precursor to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham is revealed as the friend of God when Sodom is judged by God and he will destroy it. The patriarch prays for Sodom for Lot's sake. And the Lord appeared unto him in the fields of Mamre. This is not a dream or a vision, but an actual theophany in which Jehovah appears to Abraham with two angels in physical forms. 3 measures of meal is still today used as a figure of speech in the East for putting out a feast for guests. And most people of the East, Jews, Muslims, Christians, and other Arabs alike, uh, say that the source of the 3 measures of meal euphemism is this event when the wife of Abraham specifically went and did the bread baking with 3 measures of meal. The other thing that's interesting is if you do the research on the 3 measures of meal, you will find that that was probably enough bread to feed an army. Not not just 4 men, but they probably made a feast that fed the entire household, including all the servants and everyone who was with them, because it was a feast of celebration that they had visitors in the camp. Um, and it's interesting that at first we don't even know if Abraham knows that this physical presence standing in front of him is God himself, because it just says 3 men stood before him as he sat at the opening to the tent in the heat of the day. So that's interesting. Right. Yeah. If if Melchizedek was a theophany, then Abraham should have recognized him, right? Assuming that he wouldn't just take a form of a completely different looking dude, right? Which there's no reason for him to do that. God in disguise. Um, the uh, the interesting thing to me about these theophanies in the Old Testament, I couldn't argue the point with somebody if they wanted me to prove my thesis, but I think every theophany is a Christophany. Um, Jesus is, um, pre Bethlehem called the Word of God, right? Um, and John begins the gospel by saying, "In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God." John in First John tells us that there are three that bear record in heaven: the Father, the Word, and the Spirit. Um, the Word means the expression, right? The manifestation of God has always been Jesus. That's my view of that. When God reveals himself to man, he reveals himself through Jesus. There are some interesting exceptions. Um, I'm speaking of the general course of events. At the baptism of Jesus, you have God the Word, physically revealed as God the Son, but you also have the Spirit of God descending in a form like unto a dove, and you have the voice of the Father emanating from the heavens. Um, but it seems to me that whenever we see God in a physical form personified, that it's probably always God the Word who is expressed. Uh, and so my thought is every theophany is a Christophany. But I wouldn't argue that point if somebody wanted to disagree. Yeah. Think about how many of the prophecy books begin with the words, "The word of the Lord came to the prophet, saying." The word came to the prophet, and the word was saying. I think what that means is Jesus, either physically or in a voice or speaking to the heart of the person, Jesus is the word who was saying to the prophet. So, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So that's what I see. When I see Joshua standing before the captain of the Lord, um, I think he's standing in front of Jesus. When I see, Mhm. If you look carefully at the the use of the phrase "the angel of the Lord," Malachi Yahweh, Malachi Jehovah in the Old Testament, I think every time you see that construction, "the angel of the Lord," it's always Jesus. It's always God the Word. You look at every time, it's not often you see that exact phrase, "the angel of the Lord," the messenger of Yahweh. It's always Jesus. And And the reason you know that is because it'll go back and forth between saying the angel of the Lord said and saying the Lord said in the same passage, right? So he's having a conversation with the angel of the Lord, who is also the Lord. If he's both the messenger of the Lord and he's the Lord, to me, that's Jesus. I think, and again, I didn't originate that, but it makes a lot of sense to me in every one of those passages it fits. All right, so this is not a dream or a vision, but an actual theophany in which Jehovah appears to Abraham with two angels in physical forms. 3 measures of meal is still today used as a figure of speech in the East for putting out a feast for guests. Sarah overhears God saying it is time for her to conceive, and she laughs and is chastened. She laughs and is chastened by the Lord. The angels go on to Sodom to warn Lot. The Lord tells Abraham of his decree that Sodom and Gomorrah must be destroyed for their wickedness. Abraham begins to intercede for the whole city of Sodom because his nephew lives there. God does not spare the city, indicating there are not 10 righteous persons there. Lot has a wife and 2 daughters who are at home, plus 2 daughters who are married to 2 sons-in-law. If he had even 2 grandchildren in his family, his family would have been 10 if they all believed in the Lord as God. Lot's failure as a husband and father led to the destruction of this entire community. Nobody's going to touch that one? What's really interesting about that too is the New Testament refers to him as righteous. And the only explanation for that I can give is it's talking about the righteousness that comes by faith. The only real righteousness that a sinner can have is the imputed righteousness of Christ because of faith. It's what Romans says was the source of Abram's righteousness. He believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. So the impression I get is that Lot was born again. He believed in Jehovah. He believed in the promise of a seed to come who would save the people from their sins. He was just massively backslidden, worldly, or as we say in the 21st century, he was secularized. Because, we wouldn't want to say worldly, it sounds so mean. He was a carnal Christian. I'd like to think so. Yeah. He utterly failed his family. Which brings us to chapter 19. Sodom is destroyed, but Lot is spared with his daughters and becomes the father of the Moabites and Ammonites. The angels come to Sodom and are taken into the house of Lot for protection. the men of the city want to force the strangers to have sexual relations with them. The angels blind the men at the door to keep them from assaulting Lot when he refuses to surrender the men. Lot also offered up his 2 virgin daughters at home. That's a very strange story, isn't it? It gives you a suggestion of why the people of Sodom and the sister city of Gomorrah were ready to be judged by God, right? 2 strangers come into town, and the men of the city lose all interest in their wives and the harlots in the town, and decide they want to find out what it's like to have sexual relations with these guys. And from the way this story unfolds, it seems like this is not an uncommon scenario in Sodom. Nobody's acting like it's unusual. It seems as though Lot brought these men into his home specifically to protect them from this, warning them not to stay in the street, right? But then there's this interesting thing where Lot says, "Here, take my 2 virgin daughters instead." This is either an example of our cultural biases causing us to have trouble seeing it from the Eastern practice of, what it means to be a gracious host, right? You've taken them into your homes. Now, because they're in your home, they're under your protection. Any danger that comes to them is a mark upon your honor. And so you must do whatever you can, no matter what it costs, to protect them. Yet it still seems strange to me that even under those circumstances, that Lot would say, "Here, take my daughters instead." Does that seem strange to you guys? Yep. Yeah. Yeah. She was nearly dead, and he got her on the animal and took her, started headed for home, and then she died along the way. Yeah, similar. Um, I mean, I understand that girls were second class citizens, but this is dehumanizing, right? Um, mhm. Yeah. Let's read on. The angels tell Lot the city is doomed and that his family must leave so that they can pour out God's judgment. They said, "We can do nothing until you're out of here." Think about that. All Jehovah had told Abraham is, "I will not spare the city if there are 10 righteous. I will not destroy the city if there are 10 righteous. I will spare the city," right? There aren't 10, but look at this. God is called Abraham's friend. It's proven right here. when you look at chapter 18 and what God and Jehovah were discussing, it's proven right here. Um, and let's see. And the Lord said, shall I, verse 17 of chapter 18, and the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham the thing which I do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. But when it ends simply with, if 10 shall be found there, and he said, I will not destroy it for 10's sake. And the Lord went his way as soon as he had left communing with Abraham, and Abraham returned unto his place. As far as we know, Abraham never mentioned Lot, right? But God didn't answer the prayer on his lips. He answered the prayer in his heart. God knew who Abraham was interceding for. And he answered the prayer in Abraham's heart, even though he couldn't bring himself to say it out loud. What a merciful and loving God. Yes. Gilbert's getting a sermon for Sunday right now. I've seen what he's over there jotting it down. The angels tell Lot that the city is doomed and that his family must leave so that they can pour out God's judgment. Isn't it interesting? Lot and his girls have to be gone before the judgment can fall. Wow. I know some people will take that and that becomes their argument for when the rapture takes place. Personally, I think that's a specious argument. I'm always careful whenever we're talking about arguments on controversial issues. Make sure your argument is real, and that argument is just not real. You have to, let me put it to you this way. If you presuppose that your position is correct in the argument, that's circular reasoning, right? That said, I am not saying that the pre-tribulation rapture theory is not correct. I am simply saying that argument isn't very strong. That one was free, by the way. Lot is unable to convince his sons-in-law and leaves his married daughters behind. Can you imagine that moment? Did they have any grandkids? Saying goodbye to his daughters for the last time because their husbands just won't listen? Lot's wife turns to look back as the city is destroyed and is turned into a pillar of salt. Oh, here's another thing about the sons-in-law real fast. Think about this. I got you, Gilbert. I see you. Think about this. The sons-in-law, if they had any respect for Lot, could have said, okay, you crazy old coot, you think that God is going to destroy the city, it's going to blow blah, 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 fire and brimstone. Okay, tell you what. Honey, your dad wants you to go camping with him out in the field tonight. Humor the old fool, and I'll see you tomorrow. Right? They didn't have to believe him to at least let their wife go with her family. If it was supposed to happen that night, well, tomorrow when he wakes up and the city's still here, I'm sure Lot will be back. So I'll see you tomorrow, honey. Here's a bag of victuals. Enjoy your camping trip, right? They thought he was nuts. They weren't listening to him at all, and they showed no respect or deference to him. All right, and then Lot's wife turns back to look at the city as the city is destroyed and turns into a pillar of salt. Gilbert, you had your hand up. have you ever heard of the pan-tribulation theory? Okay. Um, I will admit I've had some times in my development as a Bible student where I've looked at all of those positions and and have seen the arguments for them, but I have always been a pre-tribber. That's where I lean. Um, and honestly, though, I will say this might sound odd coming from a pre-tribber, but I think the pre-tribulation argument is pretty good. But the one that is closest in terms of the strength is actually the post-tribulation. Everything in between, um, I think there are arguments, and some of them aren't bad, but I think honestly, it the strongest argument is either we don't see any of it or we see all of it. Um, but but I wouldn't, like I said, I wouldn't argue that point. I don't think any major doctrine of the faith hinges on that, and I don't think the Bible is clear on it. So, um, yeah. And if any of you are a post-tribber, don't worry, we'll take you with us. All right. Um, Lot's wife turns into a pillar of salt. I don't know why, but I always think of this whenever I read Jesus said, "Ye are the salt of the earth," because Lot, his wife, and his family had completely failed to be the salt of the earth in their community. They had not been the preservative by living their faith and sharing their faith in the one true God and the promised seed coming from God. And if Lot had simply led the family on this side and the family on this side to the Lord, Sodom might still be there today. Um, so, is there something in Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt that is somewhat emblematic of that salt of the earth concept? Or is it just, most likely a volcano was erupting, and that's where the fire and brimstone came from, and God brought up the fire and brought it down upon the cities? Um, you know, you get hit with a blast of that ash, it'll probably turn you into a pillar of salt too. Um, Interesting how targeted it was, though, right? It hits Sodom, it hits Gomorrah, it does not hit the little village of Zoar, and none of the surrounding areas are affected. So while I do believe that the fire and brimstone came from somewhere, that they didn't just magically appear over the earth, but that God probably brought them up out of the nearby mountains and dropped them on the city, it's a pretty targeted drop to think it was just a natural event. So, and then again, the story gets weird. Lot and his daughters escape to the tiny village of Zoar. Lot's daughters get their father drunk, thinking the world has ended, and seduce him in his sleep. Each bears a son to their father. One is the father of the Moabites, and the other is the father of the Ammonites. Now, was that weird enough? I mean, what was it one of you said about being infected by um, the people that they were living among? Yeah, I suspect that they got him so drunk he was completely unconscious because it says that he didn't know when they laid down or when they got up. So um, that's a pretty depraved act. I mean, essentially, this is this is two uh, probably teenage girls raping their own father, right? This is an act of great depravity. But look where they grew up, right? Men raping men in the streets at night. Yeah, it was not uncommon for family to marry other family members either. Um, Also, keep in mind, though, from their perspective, they thought the world was over. Remember, the older of the two said to the younger of the two, um, "There is not a man on the earth to know us." They thought humanity was going to end with them. They thought that they were that Lot was the new Noah. I don't know why they hadn't noticed that Zoar hadn't been affected yet, but um, they were thinking survival requires procreation. The only thing I can suggest is they must have taken it with them. So, of all the supplies to carry when you're leaving on foot, somebody grabbed some wine. In a lot of cases, yes, depending on where you lived. So, if you didn't have a fresh water supply, so, and that may have been why they took the wine. Um, so, chapter 20, Abraham journeys to Gerar in the land of the Philistines, and again introduces Sarah only as his sister, not disclosing that she is also his wife. Whereupon the Abimelech, father king, a generational title like Pharaoh in Egypt, took her into his harem until God intervened and spared Sarah from sin and the children of Heth, the Hittites, who lived in the Gaza Strip at this time, from judgment. It is here that God calls Abraham a prophet. These are not the Philistines of the judges and the king's time, centuries later. These are the children of Heth, Hittites, who possessed the Gaza Strip at this time. The land of the Philistines is an interpolation for later readers who knew that area by that name. The Philistines didn't actually arrive in the land until the time of the Bronze Age collapse. The Philistines actually came from the Grecian islands. Most likely, they were an offshoot of the Minoan civilization, and they were invading the coastline of Phoenicia, Canaan, and Egypt at the time of the Bronze Age collapse when the judges were ruling in Israel. Um, and that brings us to Isaac. And we got 30 whole minutes to talk about the life of this patriarch. All right, so we come to section 2, part B, Isaac, chapters 21 through 25, the Christology section. In Abraham's 100th year, 25 years after he came to the promised land, the birth of Isaac is celebrated with feasting and festivity. But Ishmael mocks the occasion, creating a breach between Sarah and Hagar, leading to the bondwoman fleeing with her son Ishmael, who nearly dies of hunger and thirst at 14 years old, before God shows up and saves them both. Abraham makes a covenant with Abimelech, a non aggression treaty. Abraham plants a grove of fruit trees in Beersheba and calls upon God by a new title, Everlasting God. The birth of Isaac marks the beginning of the seed of Abraham, for God had said, "In Isaac shall thy seed be called." As Abraham is the father of the faithful, Isaac is a picture of Christ. Interesting thing, at the birth of Isaac, during the celebration, it is said that Ishmael mocks, right? Ishmael mocks. If you go to chapter 21 and you see verse 9, actually, I'm sorry, not at the birth of Isaac, but at the weaning of Isaac. So he may have been 4 or 5 by this point, because they nursed children a long time back in the day. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, which had born unto Abraham, mocking. Okay. This is really a significant moment. You know, in Exodus, we are told that it was in the 430th year that the Israelites came out of Egypt. And it's interesting because in the Masoretic text, as it appears in most of our English Bibles, it says that they spent 430 years wandering in Egypt, but in the Septuagint it says in Egypt and Canaan. And it appears that Paul, in Galatians, I believe it is, quotes from the Septuagint and says Egypt and Canaan, thus giving a New Testament authority to the Septuagint being the original. It appears. I don't think it's definitive by any means. But so the question then becomes, how much of that 430 years was it all spent in Egypt, or was some of it in the Promised Land? Well, from the year that Abraham entered the Promised Land at 75 years old, it's 215 years exactly until Jacob stands before Pharaoh. So when Jacob comes out of the Promised Land into Egypt. So one theory is that the first 250 years were in Canaan, and the next 215 years were in Egypt. Another theory is that the period of the 430 years begins here, when Ishmael, the son of the Egyptian handmaid, the half Egyptian, half brother, mocks Isaac, that this is the beginning of the sojourning and bondage and mistreatment of Isaac's seed by Egyptians. So that would actually place it roughly 30-ish years after the coming into the Promised Land, which would mean that it was about 400 years in Egypt. I'm sorry, that it was 430 years, but subtract 25 years in the Promised Land and add 25 years to Egypt, so they would have been in Egypt then about 240 years. There are other places where maybe this is where that 430-year clock starts that we'll come to later on in these stories. But I just think you're going to hear all these different theories. You're going to have people ask you about them when you're teaching Sunday school. One theory is 430 years, 215 in each place. Obviously, the opposite extreme is, no, it was 430 years all in Egypt. I will show you when we get to Exodus why I think 430 years all in Egypt cannot fit what it says in Exodus, because Exodus cannot contradict Exodus. But we'll get to that when the time comes. Or excuse me, it cannot fit what it says in Genesis, when the people came out of the promised land with Jacob into Egypt, um, it gives us the list of people who were there. And if you look at the genealogy of Moses' ancestry, it gives years of birth and years of life. You cannot get to 430 within those parameters. So, because of that, I don't think it's 430 all in Egypt, but I also don't think it's 215 in each. I don't think 215 years is enough time in Egypt for the Israelites to have grown to the size that they were when they came out. That's a population growth rate that is astronomical. So, and even still, the rate of their growth during that time is miraculous in and of itself, no matter how much time they spent in Egypt. Because even 430 years, they had phenomenal growth as a people. But anyway, I just wanted to call attention to that because I know it's something that you're going to get asked about in years to come. Chapter 22, one of my favorite chapters in all the Bible. Abraham offers Isaac, but the angel of Jehovah intervenes, and Abraham hears of his brother's family. In verse 8, Abraham prophesies that God will provide himself a lamb. This could mean God will provide for himself a lamb, or God will provide himself for a lamb. Or more likely, it means both at once. Hebrews 11 tells us that Abraham believed God would raise Isaac from the ashes. No person in history had ever risen from the dead before. So how did Abraham reason out that the only way for him to obey God and for God to also keep his promises concerning Isaac I lost my place. Hang on one second. Was for God to raise his son from the dead. How did he figure that out if he'd not only never seen anyone raised from the dead, he'd never heard of anyone being raised from the dead, because it has not ever happened in history so far. Okay. Nope, that makes sense. The only thing I can think of is that somewhere in the night, somewhere between the night when God gave Abraham this gruesome assignment, and when he reached the bottom of that hill, Abraham had reasoned this out in his mind. God made promises concerning Isaac that have not been fulfilled. They must be fulfilled. God commanded me to sacrifice Isaac. How can those promises be fulfilled if Isaac is dead? Therefore, God, who gave me a son when I had no son, God will raise my son from the dead. Call it a leap of faith, call it a leap of logic. The fact is, though, it demonstrates the elasticity of Abraham's faith. Right? It can be stretched. So here's one of those angel of Yahweh moments. The pre-incarnate Jesus, called by the name Messenger of Jehovah, or the angel of Yahweh, intervenes and stops Abraham's hand. The future son of Abraham, who was destined to die as the sacrifice for sin, stopped Abraham personally from letting Isaac try to do what only Jesus could do. Remember the law of the kinsman redeemer? What are the qualifications for the kinsman redeemer? And they had to be willing. Remember, that's why the right of the kinsman redeemer passed to Boaz in the book of Ruth, because the nearer kinsman said no. So think about this. The world has a sin debt. That sin debt is not infinite, but it's pretty big, right? And every man's life is required for his sin. I cannot die for Gilbert's sin because I only have one life to die and I have my own sin to die for. So, if every man's life is valued equally and we have a numberless, incalculable sin debt to pay, only the life of an infinite man could pay the incalculable price of sin. And in order for any man, even an infinite man, to die for someone else's sin, he would also have to have no sin of his own to die for, right? Which means he needs to not only be an infinite man, he must be an innocent man. He cannot pay the debt if he doesn't have enough life to be equal to or greater than all the lives of all mortals. He cannot pay the price if he is not himself innocent, and he must be willing to pay the price. Only the Son of God, who became the Son of Man, could have died to make the sons of men into the sons of God. No one else fits the kinsman redeemer law. So, right. So how did he come to know something, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a good question. There's two possible answers to it. One is um, one is a grammatical answer, and the other is a literary answer. Um, when God says, "For now I know," he's not denying that by foreknowledge he already knew that, right? Number one, he knew Abraham's character, and number two, he knew the future, right? So he knew that Abraham would not withhold his son and that he feared God. Um, the literary answer would be God is speaking anthropomorphically. He is he is speaking of himself as if he were a man. I find that one to be a little bit weak, but it's one possible explanation. Um, the other option is that he is speaking about what God knows as it plays out in the realm of men. For example, God could say, I know, because I know all hypothetical futures, not just all actual futures, I know that if I ask Abraham to do this, this is what will happen. But until it actually plays out in the material universe, in in the timeline of humanity, God knows it, but it hasn't been experienced yet. So God didn't have any doubt about how the story was going to turn out, but it's kind of like, are you familiar with the Schrodinger's cat problem in physics? I see Kevin nodding his head. So, so a physicist named Schrodinger suggests that um, that whenever two possible realities exist, whenever two possible outcomes exist, both exist simultaneously until there's an observation of what happened. Um, if you put a cat in a box with something that will kill the cat, but it will go off at a random, unpredictable time, the cat is then basically existing in two states, dead and not dead, until somebody opens the box and looks in the box. Because quantum physics seems to indicate until reality is observed, it is not locked in. So the quantum physics answer to this is God knew what was going to happen, but until it actually happened, it was only a theoretical happening and not an actual happening. I don't know that any of those really answer the question, what does it mean for God to say, now I know? Um, the only thing I can say is now in Hebrew has in it the idea of at this time or in this time, but it's not necessarily exclusive to any other time, right? God didn't say, now I have come to discover. He said, now I know, right? So God does know now, but because God knows now, he also knew then, and he will also know then, right? Um, but honestly, I think the most obvious, simplest answer, the one that makes the fewest assumptions, comes down to sometimes God speaks of himself my mind just went totally blank as my tongue twisted. Anthropomorphically, um, and he speaks of himself as if he were a man in order to communicate things in ways that our minds understand. Yeah, yes, but because he is God, he already had perfect knowledge of them before he experienced them. That's the that's the part that is so difficult for us to understand. How do you wrap your mind around that? It's one thing to say it, right? It's another thing to truly get it because it's outside of our experience. Right. Yes. Okay, after this, God spoke again to Abraham and confirmed the covenant once again. This is another example of where, you know, Abraham's, we're told by Paul that it was 430 years from the giving of the promise that the Exodus occurred, right? Paul told us that in the New Testament. Which giving of the promise? The giving of the promise to Jacob as he was on his way into Egypt, making it 430 years in Egypt. The giving of the promise to Jacob at Bethel. The giving of the promise here when Isaac was sacrificed. The giving of the promise when Abram first entered Ur of the Chaldees at 75 years old. There are so many givings of the promise to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob that it's hard to know for sure what exactly Paul meant when he said 430 years from the giving of the promise, right? But it's one of these givings of the promise. So Abraham has offered Isaac. The angel of the Lord has intervened. The promises are restated. And then Abraham receives a report about his brother's family growing in Haran or Syria. Isn't it interesting that immediately after this, Sarah dies, and the next thing Abraham does is send for a bride for Isaac? But after Abraham sacrifices his son, he is not seen or heard from again until he comes out and meets his bride. Do with that whatever you will. It's just an observation. Yes. But we don't see Isaac appear in the narrative again after this until he comes out to meet his bride. Another interesting thing about this, Abraham received the vision apparently in Beersheba, and they take a 3-day journey to the mountains of Moriah. And it could be Mount Calvary, it could be the Temple Mount, it could be the Mount of Olives. There's multiple mountains in that area, and it's not really specifically said that it's a specific mountain here, except God said it'll be the one I will show you. But think about the options. Was it the Temple Mount where the sacrifices would be made? Was it Mount Calvary where Jesus was offered? Was it the Mount of Olives from which Jesus ascended and to which he will return? They're all in that same area. This is the area that would later be called Jerusalem. It says the mountains of, it speaks of Moriah as an area, not as a specific mountain. Much like when Noah landed, it speaks of the mountains of Ararat, not Mount Ararat, right? We don't know for sure which hill Isaac was sacrificed on, but we do know that it's in the vicinity where Jesus was crucified, where the Temple Mount was, and where the Mount of Olives is. And isn't it interesting? Isaac made the determination the night God spoke to him that he was going to offer Isaac. In his own mind, in his own heart, he was already a sacrifice. And then God gave Abraham Isaac's life back 3 days later. You think that's a coincidence? I think it is too. Get my pages back where they're supposed to be here. Okay. So in chapter 23, Sarah dies, and the tomb of the patriarchs is purchased from Ephron the Hittite. The patriarchal negotiation for the land is common for the culture of the Middle East. Why, the land is only worth, 38 cents. What's that between people as rich as you and me? Just keep it. But if you just keep it, then have you really bought it? Is it really yours? No, I want to give you money for it. How much is it worth? Well, just only $1 million. Oh, well, if it's only $1 million, let me just pull out my Amex Black Card and we'll get that done right here. It's a negotiation tactic common in the Middle East, and it's still there today. You know, but a place is purchased where Sarah is the first to be buried, Abraham is the next, Isaac and Ishmael meet at the tomb of the patriarchs to bury their father, Abraham. It might be the first and last time as grown men that Isaac and Ishmael come together as brothers to do something significant. And it's the burial of Abraham. And keep in mind, Isaac, at this time, when Abraham dies, would be 75, which means his brother, who is 13 years older, is 88. It's a significant moment in human history when Isaac and Ishmael met as brothers. Isaac has come to age. I'm sorry, go ahead. Yes. Right. Yep. They might have met at the funeral. Isaac has come to age in chapter 24. He is 40 years old. Seems a little old to get married to most of us, but there it is. And Abraham sends his eldest servant, likely Eleazar, though he's never named, to his family in Syria to find a bride for the son of promise. When Rebekah returns with him, Isaac, who has not appeared in the narrative since being offered, comes out from his father's house to claim his bride. This story is really interesting. And the parallels in this story between these events and what happens when Jacob returns to Haran and meets Rebekah are also interesting, right? There's some really interesting commonalities. This is one of the longer chapters, and honestly, it does have a lot of repetition. Where this is what happened when Abraham had the conversation with the servant. Then the servant recounts almost word for word what happened when Abraham had the conversation with the servant, when the servant is sitting in front of Abraham's relatives, right? My favorite phrase in this entire chapter is what is what they said to the servant, her family. They said, the thing proceeds from the Lord, we cannot say yes or no, right? It's not up to us. God said it. Here it is. Clearly, this is God's plan. So they take the girl, or the servant and whoever was with him, take the girl, and they leave. It's interesting. Abraham knows his family up in Syria are idol worshippers, but he would prefer those idol worshippers to the Canaanite idol worshippers around him. Maybe because they're worse, maybe because they have much more, um, horrific sin in their culture. Maybe it's just a preference. He wants a Semitic Sumerian wife for his son Isaac. Chapter 25. Though Abraham marries again. Oh wow, it's already 2:06. All right, we'll finish chapters 25 and 26 as we begin Jacob tomorrow. Sorry to keep you guys a minute late. Thanks for your attention, and I will see you tomorrow.